Hey there, Aligned You listeners. This is Dr. M here, and welcome to our Aligned and Thriving season and series of interviews. I am super pumped to be sharing a series of stories and interviews with some amazing humans. People, some who I've admired from a distance for a long period of time, others who I know personally and call dear friends and feel very privileged to do so. This series is designed to actually dive deeper into what allows them to truly live an aligned you life and to be thriving, whether that's in their work life, their home life, or their play life, and working out truly, is there common themes or is everyone different and we really do all reach our full potential in our own unique way. Enjoy this season. I've had an absolute pleasure and joy recording it. I'm your host, Dr. M, and you're listening to Aligned You, a podcast designed to assist you to truly be aligned through your body, head, and heart so you can reach your full potential in your own unique way. Hey there, Aligned You listeners, Dr. M here, and I am very excited and so very grateful because the amazing Dr. Andrea Huddleston has agreed to jump back on the mic with me for a second time so we can dive deeper into more about all things hormones and female business, which is so important, and I'm seeing it being more and more important in a modern day world. In case you didn't get to hear our previous interview with Dr. Andrea, is that Andrea is a women's health and natural fertility specialist, an integrative chiropractor. She practices in Fremantle in Western Australia. She's a co-host of the award-winning podcast Wellness Women Radio. I still struggle to get my mouth around that one, saying it fast, and is affectionately referred to as the period whisperer by her patients. In addition to her chiropractic degrees, Dr. Andrea holds 2 postgraduate degrees, folks. That's 2 postgraduate degrees because one was not enough. She has a master's degree in women's health, medicine, and reproductive medicine. She's also trained in nutritional and functional medicine. Dr. Andrea is a global leader in women's health, as well as an educated and sought after presenter. And just quite frankly, folks, is a dead set legend. Welcome to Aligned You, Dr. Andrea. How are you this morning, my friend?
I'm doing great, Dr. M. Thanks so much for having me back. And it was so funny. I got so many messages from people after the last podcast going, "What do you mean I shouldn't be fasting?" That was where so many of the questions came from. And I went, okay, hold on. Let's talk about that.
We might need to bust that out a little bit more today.
Yeah, and because obviously, fasting is so trendy these days, right? And it just seems like, the answer to everybody's problems, because particularly, in perimenopause and menopause, when women go through that middle-age spread, as that awful, thing that they call it, that middle-age spread, which is not inevitable, by the way.
But I want to talk more about that today. You've actually preempted one of my questions that I had written down. You're like not only the period whisperer, but a mind reader.
Excellent. Dr. M, jump in. What was your question about that? Do you want to tackle it straight away?
Well, we definitely can. I think what's so interesting is that of all the various things that we spoke about over the last episode, where, folks, if you haven't listened to that episode, it's an excellent episode. It's all about busting through brain fog and perimenopause. And one of the things that Dr. Andrea and I were discussing was whether intermittent fasting is the answer to everything, because it gets bantied around a lot. And I also think that there's such a focus, and I get why, because I'll speak to this in a moment, but there's such a focus on, you've hit perimenopause or you're now menopausal and your weight seems to have, and body shape has shifted by 5 to 10 kilos. And therefore it's almost like equals failure, versus what does that actually mean? And perhaps what I'd love to dive into today, a little bit more of your thoughts on the best tools and best ways to approach things once our metabolism and our hormone balance has shifted so much. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I also think sometimes people take that a bit out of context and they just hear don't fast, but it's all within context, right?
It's totally all within context. And women are just completely different creatures to men. And I think that's what we have to keep remembering, and remembering that pretty much all of the research on intermittent fasting, again, I've got to repeat that, has been done on men, and men can literally fast all day long and they'll be completely fine for the most part, as long as their stress hormones and everything are sort of in balance. But for women, our bodies, our rhythms, our hormonal shifts throughout the day are completely different. So we shouldn't be trying to eat like men, for example. So women can do a form of fasting, but actually eating breakfast for women, particularly during perimenopause and menopause, I think is actually one of the most kind of satiating things they can do, because you're going to help to stabilize blood sugar levels straight away. You're going to help to bring that cortisol down as well. So it's just a really nice, nurturing, nourishing thing you can do for your body. And then if you want to fast on that other end of the day, then go for it. So have dinner a bit earlier, have a lighter dinner. You can still do like a really decent, 12, 14 hour fast overnight, but shift your food to have breakfast, eat breakfast, and it will make a huge difference to your energy levels as well. This whole weight gain issue that we see in women as they go through that transition is one of the main reasons that I'm seeing perimenopausal or menopausal women at the moment. And it's so frustrating for them as well, because they will be eating and exercising the same way that they have pretty much their entire life, but all of a sudden they're just putting on weight. And I'm even seeing women who are very, very lean saying, what is going on with my body? I've gone up, 2 dress sizes and I'm not okay with it. So, it's understandably frustrating.
It's a thing. I think when we recorded our last episode, it must have been maybe about 6 months ago. And in that period of time is and folks, again, context for why I reached out to the brilliant Dr. Andrea is that I was in struggle street. Absolute struggle street with my perimenopause at that point. I just started podcasting again after having 6 months off not podcasting for the severity of my brain fog. And after we'd spoken, Andrea, and I'd love to talk more about it in a moment today, we were talking about baselines and what sort of things we should be putting up with, what sort of things we shouldn't be putting up with. I'd done all the things I thought of that I possibly could have from a more natural approach, or my idea of a natural approach and non-invasive, to then the best thing I ever fucking did, and I will use those terms, is I went on HRT, and last year my world changed. I started sleeping again. I had an appointment with an endocrinologist. I don't know if you know Dr. John Eden, but he's quite amazing. And he just said, You're so simple. Do this and this. And I went, and the thing that really landed for me last year was his words, with the severity of your symptoms. And I went, is this severe? He went, you have severe symptoms. Like, this is a sign your biorhythms are completely out of whack. But what then happened was, whilst I started sleeping and I could start metabolizing alcohol again, that was fun. But what also then happened was, all of a sudden I put on 10 kilos really, really fast. And I woke up one morning, looked in the mirror, went, oh my God, I have my mother's gut. And it's this, just a tummy. And so and I'm speaking to clients and friends of mine that are going through similar things, and we're most of us are in very similar positions. So I'd love to hear more about what your thoughts are on all of that, and what's the best ways to counteract that. And my endocrinologist, one of the things in our last conversations that he said to me was, there might be an offset. You might, if we do something different with your hormones, it might mean you're not sleeping as well. I'd love your thoughts around that.
Yeah, sure. Holy moly. Okay, so there's so much to unpack.
I realised there was a lot there.
Maria, and look, I am definitely not opposed to HRT, especially if women are really suffering with their symptoms, like you've mentioned. It's a tool to use, but to use appropriately in the right circumstances. Mm-hmm. And there's always, in my opinion, an escalation before you get there, or there's so many different things to try before that's the next step. And when we talk about HRT, I always try and opt for bioidentical hormones first. And there's really great bioidentical options that are being used very commonly these days by endocrinologists and hormone specialists who, will prescribe essentially, and the body identical hormones are essentially, they're made in a lab, but they're made to be identical to what the body makes. Whereas traditional HRT is synthesized from other, from estrogen, for example, from other sources. Particularly, it used to be made from the urine of pregnant mares.
Yes, that's a very American one. I begin to understand an American way of doing it.
And this was the original way that HRT was sort of made initially. And sometimes that HRT does just not fit and match a woman's body, you know, because your diet doesn't consist of grass and hay and all of those sorts of things.
We're not horses.
And you're not the same size and you're not pregnant either. But also it can be so much stronger than what your body's making, which is almost like putting women on, you know, the pill, for example. It's a similar sort of mechanism. And for women, that can increase your risk of all sorts of things, depending on how well your body can metabolize and clear those hormones. So that's another layer that I like to consider when women are considering, for example, HRT, is what are those elimination pathways doing and how safe is this going to be for you individually? So we might do, say, an estrogen metabolite test to assess the efficacy and safety of those options for that individual patient. Or we might try and use as absolute low dose as possible to get the biggest shift so that it's within, you know, what we would consider to be a safe threshold. But none of that takes the place of the dietary and lifestyle and stress reduction changes that have to be put in place for women around this time as well. Otherwise, I think you're just adding fuel to the fire because, like you said, Maria, all of a sudden you're sleeping again. So you think you can get away with drinking alcohol again, and it couldn't be further from the truth. So
I can't really. I'm booze free again at the moment. No, I gave it a nudge, and then I came to realise that was a bad idea. So I'm doing 28 days booze free at the moment just to recalibrate.
Oh, good on you. So, Maria, there's this great book that, look, I've got it right beside me.
Oh, something I prepared earlier. Yeah.
And this is she's actually a Perth woman, and she talks about like the grey area of drinking, and particularly it's aimed for women and how to, you know, come off alcohol a little bit or for whatever, you know, would suit you. So I think the 28 days to start with is a great idea. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love a cocktail, and I think you know that already. But as we get older, alcohol just wreaks havoc for women. It really shifts our metabolism. It takes us ages to be able to clear that and essentially detoxify it from our system. And it just is like almost like a fat storage mechanism when we're drinking. And for some reason, just as our hormones shift, as our liver clearance changes a little bit, and that happens with the reduction in estrogen from our system, then we just can't get away with alcohol the same way.
I know, it's true. Another book to add to the mix, if Aligned You listeners are writing it down, is there's a book that I read recently, which I was already doing the 28 days booze free, but it was had some really great points in it. It's a book called Mindful Drinking. And then it talks about different rules to create. So it talks about actually doing a 28-day reset. And then beyond that is to set yourself up some parameters with an understanding of your own human behavior. So, for example, I'm a people pleaser abstainer when it comes to drinking, in the sense of what does that mean is that I became known as being the person that could last the longest at long lunches, and it almost became the expectation of if I was going out with certain people, and then I didn't want to let people down. That was my people pleasing. Or if you said, oh, really feel like having a drink, will you have one with me? We'd be like, nah. And if you said, come on, I go, okay, I'm helping out. Yeah. And then the other part to that being is that from an abstainer point of view, if I'm not drinking, I'm not drinking. I have no problem going out with other people that are. I thoroughly enjoy vibing off their vibration to a point. But when it's not knowing, it's once I get going, it's actually having the willpower to stop. So I'm a bit of an all or nothing kind of lady, and that flows through many aspects of my life. This is not news. It was just news of like, I hadn't really looked at it like that from a drinking point of view. But a question around that middle-aged spread, or that wake up one morning and look at thinking, oh my God, for me, I've got my mother's stomach. And it's just a really different, it's a shift in how, and I know this for many people I've been speaking to of late, it's a real shift in how we're carrying weight. And so part of the reason why clothes don't fit anymore is literally our shape has changed. Do you see with most of your clients that snaps back? Clearly it's snapping back a truck ton slower. what sort of parameters or expectations, if you're eating really well, you're doing the right things, you're not fasting for too long, you're minding when you're starting coffee, all of the other tools are in place. Because I think for most of us, and I'll make a generalization, don't want to speak for the rest of womanhood, but I think the things that kind of are most obvious to other people is our shape. And then the next most obvious is if our moods and our brain fog is being affected. But the weight is something that is so obvious to other people. And it's the first thing that a lot of people start talking about. What sort of mindset shifts do you talk with your clients around that, as to just creating expectations that are realistic for what changes they can expect and how hard they are going to be to elicit?
Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, it really depends on the woman. It depends what she's been doing leading up to this point as well. And I think that through our cycling years, so just, even when we're having regular menstrual cycles, we tend to ignore all the signs and symptoms that our body are giving us, that we might need a little bit more rest, or we might need to change, or up our protein or something along the lines, because we just kind of go. And that is pretty typical of modern women in modern life. And then when we get to perimenopause, we just keep trying to do the exact same things, whereas our stress hormones can't necessarily tolerate it. We do need more sleep. We do need more rest. We need more purpose and fulfillment, and we need to be living for ourselves, not everybody else. So, Maria, that inherent people pleasing is absolutely going to be your detriment as your hormones shift, because this is the time it teaches you that you have to be living for you, if that makes sense.
Ooh. Absolutely.
It's,
that's like a mic drop. Can you say that again? Because I think everyone listening to this needs to hear it again. Male and female, by the way, all genders need to understand the importance of giving yourself oxygen first.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the gifts, I guess, that perimenopause and menopause will teach women is that they actually have to be living for themselves. So that means that the people pleasing and the rushing around being everything to everybody and putting themselves last absolutely has to change. And the women who tend to do the best during this time are the ones who are able to reestablish what their sense of purpose is and actually really look at their own self-care. And that doesn't mean just going for massages or having bubble baths or anything like that. It's that true self-care with what are their needs and are they being met in all aspects of their life. And then that will translate into, it's easier to eat better, to fuel themselves the way they want to be moving how their body needs and everything else, because they're prioritizing that for themselves. Does that make sense? That
makes so much sense. Oh, absolutely. And I think for many people, in terms of the oxygen to myself first, is I've been doing that for a long time. It's probably it's just easier around drinking, but that's a whole other story. But there's from the general self-care side of things, I think there's an element of the consistent. I talk about it a lot when I'm talking about my body stress score quiz, which people can get a hold of on the alignedyou.com.au website, is that consistent slip and check of what's my system showing me right now. I did an episode recently about the feather, the brick and the truck, where Dr. Andrea and I were actually meant to record last year, but that was when I was a genius and decided to attempt to put my hand through a piece of wood and actually fractured my hand, folks. It wasn't a good moment. We haven't unpacked that yet. That's probably an off-air conversation. But so we had to reschedule because my hand was throbbing. You could have actually probably heard my hand on this recording had we attempted to record on that particular day. But I think there's that element of that consistent check-in about is what we're doing for ourselves right now serving us, or do we actually need to slip and check it again? Perfect example this way. I'm back-to-back weekends of seminars being hosted in a MRC. I'm not leading them, but I'm participating in them. So instead of trying to burst my boiler this week doing a whole lot of stuff that isn't super important, my time out of practice is actually going to be resting.
Yeah. Great.
Yes. And I think that moment, super important that there's that consistent slip and check, and just being okay to cancel some stuff or to put things on hold and not to try and do everything in that day or week.
Yeah, right. God, we're all so busy. And I think that a little while ago we used to wear that as a badge of honor, but I think we're starting to shift away from that a little bit now. And just the idea of just slowing down almost feels like a breath of fresh air.
Absolutely.
I haven't figured out how to do that yet, but
I've got it. You're still on a slightly different timeline at the moment. You lucky thing. But in saying that, I mean, I feel very blessed for where I am at the moment at 47 to be super healthy and well, and that this has been my biggest challenge over the last couple of years. I'll take it as my challenge. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Andrea, on. We talked about a little bit around baseline testing and when people should start getting baseline testing done. We were going to touch on as well, which we totally ran out of time last month was 6 months ago. How's that brain fog going? Just said it was sorted out, perhaps not. Is we were also going to touch on some other issues that perhaps are hormonally driven, things like endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome. What sort of signs and signals should women be looking at earlier on in their journey as somebody who is cycling and has female hormones? What sort of things should people be looking at that aren't normal? Because one of the things I find, and I would use my sexuality as an example of this. People go, well, how come you didn't know you were gay? And it's like, because I didn't know I was straight either. I had nothing to compare to. So in terms of from hormone, I thought everyone thought like I did. How was I meant to know they didn't? You're not in my head. In the same way as when we're not in each other's bodies, and if your experience has always been painful periods and you don't know that other people don't have that experience, what are some of the key signs and signals at any age in life that people that have female hormones, what should they be looking for?
Okay. Great questions, and I want to run through that really specifically, but I also don't want to forget to come back to just some metabolic tips for perimenopausal and menopausal women, just so that they've got some action steps for that.
Let's do that first, and then we'll drop it. Let's do that first, and then we can come back to my next question, not like me to jump ahead.
Okay, awesome. So in my experience, this is probably the best tips that I can give to women in terms of their metabolism and trying to help avoid that middle age spread during perimenopause and menopause. So the things that you are doing day to day, your body is just going to get used to. So your metabolic set point becomes very rigid. So we have to keep the body like guessing, which is why I think women will find if they do intermittent fasting for a little bit, they'll go, oh, this is amazing. I'm getting such great changes. But then within often a few weeks or a few months, their body will absolutely plateau and will go back up. So, and the reason being is that they're just expecting the one thing to suit them always, and it's not going to be the case. So you have to keep your metabolism in check or guessing, and we can do that with both diet and exercise. During perimenopause, our fasting blood sugar levels do unfortunately just start to creep up a little bit. And women will also notice, and their doctors might freak them out, that their cholesterol is all of a sudden increasing despite a change in their diet and exercise. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and it's nothing to be concerned about in my opinion, because the changes in cholesterol, you've got to remember that cholesterol is a building block for your hormones. So as your body's trying to make more hormones, it's going to increase your cholesterol to try and do that. But also as estrogen starts to decline, it slows down the clearance of LDL cholesterol through the liver. So when you understand those mechanisms, you won't freak out about it. And as long as your diet is conducive for that, you're not drinking too much alcohol, you're exercising, and your liver and gut are working really well, then it should be, completely fine. Just something to keep an eye on. I totally digress there, but it's something that comes up all the time with women freaking out, going, what's going on with my cholesterol? And those are the reasons why. So you have to keep your metabolism in guessing. So this might mean doing some interval training and continuously change the interval training, or start an exercise or movement regime you've never done before, so that your body has to adapt to a completely different way of, moving or exercising. So for example, if you've always been lifting weights and you've always been doing it in the same way, then could you decrease those, increase your reps, or start doing some HIIT training with it? If you've always been a cardio person, then let's add in some weights. And that weight-bearing exercise is going to be essential for your bone strength and everything else as you go through this middle-age transition anyway. And the same is true for your food as well. So typically women do better on a low-carb type regime through this stage. They'll do better on less refined sugar. They'll do better, usually gluten-free as well. Look, I'm very much generalizing here. We know that gluten increases the quote-unquote bad estrogen. So we have seen a big shift in women's hot flushes and those sorts of things when they are following a gluten-free diet. But I think rather than just swapping everything to gluten-free, it's more using whole foods instead of. And this might also mean that as we go lower carb, we're increasing our protein intake, which is helping with that lean muscle mass. There's also this interesting idea that as we go through perimenopause, our metabolism needs to shift to be more ketogenic adaptive, meaning that we need to get better at burning fat as fuel rather than glucose as fuel. It doesn't mean that all women should go on a ketogenic diet, but I think that that speaks to us having lower carbs, more protein, and more healthy fats. So those are my main tips.
I love that. And for those of the listeners, and I'd be one of the listeners or the host that probably would put my hand up on this one, is if you're doing all of those things that you just mentioned and things are still not moving, is there at any point where you just give a nod and go, just actually go get a new wardrobe? Is there anything, is there certain things that just won't snap back and that our shape is just now moving into the second half of our life, and along with the wisdom comes a new wardrobe?
Well, Maria, I think that that's a really lovely way to look at it. And I had a patient the other day, and she has been killing herself to stop drinking and stop eating certain things. And I think she's probably in her late 60s, and she's such a social butterfly, and she's retired, and her favorite thing is to have these long lunches with her girlfriends and to feed her family and to cook for her family. And she is probably carrying an extra 10 kilos, but she's killing herself to try and shift it. Or she's making herself feel so guilty when she is, say, having that glass of wine that she loves so much. And we sort of got to the point where I was like, you're not even enjoying life when you're doing these things. So as long as we can keep this within a realm that it's not terribly detrimental to your health, then why are you trying to kill yourself over this when you love doing these sorts of things so much? And it is part of your socialization and almost part of her identity. And so we resolved the fact that, yes, the weight might move a bit slower, and that's okay, but she shouldn't also beat herself up or feel guilty for doing those things that she just, lights her up. And I'm not saying alcohol is the answer for that, but it's the socialization, it's the connection. It's all
I think that social connection is so important, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So I think, yes, with middle age, a new wardrobe I think is a great thing. And also I think we have such an attachment to a number on a clothes tag, and if it's just not going to fit us anymore, it's like we wouldn't be trying to get into the clothes that we were still wearing as a teenager. Your 30-year-old.
I've seen some people try that. It's not good. They should let it go. There's a song from Frozen about that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But, our 30-year-old body is different to our 20-year-old body, just as our 40-year-old body is different to our 30-year-old body, and it absolutely should be. But structurally, it changes as well, and that is not something that women have control over. So, structurally, as we get into our mid-40s, our pelvis, even biomechanically, is shaped differently to what it was in our mid-20s. So, that's my sort of 2 cents on that.
And while to finish off the perimenopause, menopausal metabolic change with the hormone shift, can you explain to the listeners a bit more about why that tummy comes on to start with? Because I see that even I'm sure you see it every day. I see it in my mates that are lean. They've been size 8s all of their life, and now all of a sudden they've got this little pot belly, which is devastating to them, and they have never had to deal with that sort of body shape change, and they're not happy. I find that those of us that perhaps have gone through more ups and downs, like, it's just another up, we'll go down, or, it just might mean a new wardrobe. But it's those people that have been really consistent shape-wise since they were teenagers, and not much has changed since their teenage years, that are sometimes the most affected.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can understand that as well. But Maria, I also love your take on that, where you're like, oh, well, we'll just ride it out for a few months and we'll get into a fat burning, method again, or our metabolism will shift again. Let's just wait it out. And I think that that's totally okay as well, because women will go through ebbs and flows. For some women, they gain a little bit more weight in winter, but then it will naturally drop off in summer, and that's just part of their normal seasonal change. And again, that's totally okay. So that kind of middle-aged spread, which I know sounds so terrible, but the increased adipose,
the tummy that pops.
Yeah, so that little pot belly that you're referring to, or the spare tire that some women call it as well,
small
is
muffin.
Definitely is a hormonal weight gain, and it's related to a few different things. So one is cortisol. So cortisol is one of our main stress hormones. It stores weight around that midsection. The other thing is insulin as well, and insulin is a fat storage hormone. And so cortisol dictates essentially if you look at our hormonal system like a symphony orchestra, everything has to be finely tuned and in balance. And cortisol dictates the note or the tone to which that whole symphony is tuned to. And it's the most important hormone that we have. It's the only one we can't live without. So everything else will be sacrificed to make more cortisol. And when we are stressed and under the pump all day, every day, we're not getting enough downtime, sleep, rest, relaxation, everything else, then our cortisol will be excessive. It'll be robbing progesterone, which will mean we'll have this relative estrogen excess, which is also fat storage as well. And then eventually you fall off the cliff. There's only so long that you can have that elevated cortisol for, and then you drop into this low cortisol sort of zone, which is what they used to call adrenal fatigue. It's a bit of an erroneous term, but essentially it's this big dysfunction between the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, and then we get this slowing down of your thyroid as well. So then, the metabolism shifts and slows as well. So there's a few different hormones that are related to that midsection weight gain. Cortisol, insulin, and estrogen are the three main ones. But again, if your thyroid's out of whack as well, that will do it too.
And I think that probably is a beautiful segue into some baselines, because I think everything you touched on when it comes to our metabolism, actually, before we jump there, just one more thought about that is the importance of actually giving yourself some time and grace to get it right. That's why I give myself this much grace, because it's not that I'm not doing the right things, is that it's that I can be very once I'm in and I'm dialed in, I get stuff done. And it's just really interesting. I think I'm day 22 of the 28 days at the moment. I'll go through to 40, and then I've got things planned out of how I'm going to do things next, because I just am giving myself some grace. Last year was a shit show of stress for a multitude of levels, not just from my personal health, for my beautiful wife's health. There was just a lot going on in our world. And when I look back at the last 12 months, I'm like, wow, we actually came out the other side pretty freaking good considering what was going on. And so to actually give myself a grace, if it took, well, let's really face it, it was probably in my system, and the listeners might appreciate this for how long sometimes things are building. If I look back, it was probably the stress on my system since 2018 when my mum was diagnosed with cancer and I went through a divorce. That's 5-6 years of stress, moving cities, selling a business, starting a different business. There was a lot happening. So if it's taken 6 years to get to this point, I can't expect to do a 4-week shred and hope that I suddenly am back to where I was in 2017. It's just not going to happen. And I think that realistic expectation just takes the pressure off of what we're trying to achieve. If you're doing all the right things most of the time, then, and things aren't moving, then, as I said, maybe it's just time I get a new wardrobe. But that's where it's giving ourselves a little bit of grace rather than continue, as you were talking about your client, in your words, killing herself and missing out on the joy of life. Because what's the point if we're not actually getting those magic moments with our family or our friends? You might not like your family, so you might not get magic moments with them. But with whomever you get magic moments with, if you're not amplifying those and making more of them, what's it all for anyway? So I love all of that. Thank you for sharing that. In terms of, back to my question about people that have female hormones, what are some of those signs and signals, as I mentioned, if you, much earlier on in the progression of your hormone journey, is what signs and signals should people be looking out for that are indicative that their periods or their hormones are not behaving how they perhaps should be?
So I am a bit of a stickler for this because my version of normal is very different to what is taught, because we get a monthly report card each month in the form of our period while we're cycling, and in the form of all of the signs and symptoms that lead up to our monthly bleed, that will tell us how well we are looking after ourselves, essentially, because all of those signs and symptoms are messages from our body about what's going on. And in my opinion, a normal period is a monthly cycle. So somewhere between 26 to 32 days. Anything outside of that is either too short or too long, in my opinion. Now, obviously, as we get into perimenopause, one of the most common signs of that perimenopausal shift is a slight shortening of the cycle. So instead of coming every, say, 28 to 30 days, it might be coming every 26, 25, and then it sort of starts to shorten. That is one of the earlier signs because of that shift or drop off of progesterone initially, which is the first hormone that changes. And we've got about 400 chances to get this right. So that's on average how many periods women have in their lifetime, depending on their hormonal contraceptive use and their number of pregnancies and all of those sorts of things. But let's say on average, we've got about 400 chances to get this right. So if you're a woman who has horrific pain around ovulation, if you notice that you become an absolute monster for 2 weeks of the month, and you have really horrific mood swings and everything else that happen in that sort of premenstrual window, then that is a sign that there's actually something going on there. Normal periods, normal cycles are just a very smooth, easy ride. So usually you will bleed for 4 or 5 days. The first couple of days are heavier. It starts with fresh red blood. There's no big, heavy clots. It's not like the floodgates are opening. It's an easy transition, a bit heavier for a couple of days, tapers off to nothing. The amount of bleed is important as well. So somewhere around, on average, about 60 mils. More than 80 mils is far too much. That's too heavy. Less than 25 mils might mean that you haven't ovulated. So the amount, the quality, the
How do people measure that, really Dr. Andrea?
Well, it depends on what they're using as their sort of menstrual hygiene. So period cups do often have like little measuring sort of things on the sides, or they'll tell you what the volume of them is. Tampons and pads will tell you also what the absorbency is. So, for example, a regular tampon might have the absorbency of 5 to 10 grams, or it should be milliliters, I think, as well.
Who knew? I mean, you knew, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's kind of how you sort of do the rough maths on that. But if your period is like really watery and quite a pale pink color, then that is something that we normally see with declining levels of estrogen. If you've got really heavy, dark, almost burgundy coloured blood that is really heavy and very clotty, that can be a sign of that excess estrogen relative to low progesterone. Usually we see the big clots with some, liver congestion, but also low iron as well. And paradoxically, women who have low iron often have heavier periods as well. So these are sort of all the signs and symptoms that this period can show you. And then the period should stop. We should see a rise in our energy levels and our libido and a shift in our headspace and everything up to sort of ovulation. We should be feeling the best around that ovulatory time. We should get clear signs of ovulation. So whether women are tracking their basal body temperature, they're using some sort of biotech for that. So I use my Oura Ring. Other women might be using an Apple Watch or whatever it might be. If you're not tracking your basal body temperature, you might see changes in your cervical mucus. So that egg white, that raw egg white consistency that you might have for a few days in the middle of that month. And then you'll start to notice a shift in your body in the premenstrual sort of weeks leading up to your period, where you might feel like you want to slow down a little bit. You may not feel as sociable. You might find that you're a little bit more sensitive, but that shouldn't translate to you turning, like having this huge emotional roller coaster where you're crying at an Oprah commercial 1 minute and then screaming at the kids the next. That is not normal. And all of those are signs and symptoms of this hormonal imbalance that's also then messing with your neurotransmitters as well. So it should just be a fairly smooth ride. And then your period comes and you should notice a rise in your energy levels again. And in my opinion, there's no such thing as normal period pain. So a period can be mildly uncomfortable, that might require a heat pack or some movement, or like the uterus lift techniques that we use, but it shouldn't be anything that you ever require pain relief for or have to miss work or school or whatever it is. It shouldn't interfere with your daily life. It should be a time where we're listening to our body, we're slowing down a little bit, maybe taking a break from the gym or whatever that might be, just for those, particularly the heavier days. But it shouldn't be anything that interferes with our daily life. And that's absolutely possible, in my opinion, for all women, irrespective of what their history has been.
Okay, so with that being said, because I have a sense that many pharmaceutical companies would be very disappointed with that news, that we shouldn't require any of that for a regular period in our 400 report cards, there'll be some people that are on to listening to today's episode giving themselves high fives and going, yes, that's me. I have a sense there'll be a very large portion of people listening to this going, holy fuck, I never had a period like that in my life. Yeah. So if that is them, if they happen to have just heard what you said and just got so much gold in those few phrases, Andrea, seriously, it's just amazing. And it's stuff that I'm sad that we don't talk about more and that it's not what gets shared more. So if people are actually they are not the gold standard of what should be happening for a period, and they are going for naprogesics or they're going for some sort of other medication regularly, or they know, or their family actually is probably the one giving the report card going, oh, honey, I can tell it's coming, and they're battening down the hatches.
Gosh, that's so common, isn't it? Yep.
Because a report card of like, or just even growing up with siblings where they knew what was happening before you did because of the mood you're in. Perhaps that's just me, but it's what should people be doing? What are the first right steps? Because we had this conversation or similar conversation on our last episode together where there's a lot of misinformation, and that's not what most people get told. If they went to their local GP would tell them it was perfectly normal and pat them on the bum and go tell them to take something for it. What are some things that who should people be seeing? What are some things that you could be trying? Obviously, these are broad strokes in general because everybody's an individual. I also think that this also happens sometimes with these sorts of conversations is it gets a little bit too of a broad stroke across everybody. And then people go, oh, it worked for Dr. M or it worked for Dr. Andrea, so therefore it's going to work for me. There's so many nuances to all of this, which I understand. I hope the listeners do too. But talking broad strokes and generalizations, who should people be trying to see? What sort of tests should they be insisting on? And what are some steps that they maybe can take to start getting better report cards from themselves and their family members?
So let's break that down. Let's talk about testing first. Now, if you're working with a really great GP or a functional medicine practitioner or someone along those lines, then hopefully they'll be doing some blood tests, particularly around day 21 or 7 days after ovulation, to look at what the ratios between your estrogen and progesterone are and see how those hormones are tracking. Now, you don't necessarily have to do blood tests for your hormones just to assess that, because often signs and symptoms can be an indication enough alone. So, for example, if a woman is having really heavy, painful periods, if she's getting lots of breast tenderness before her period, lots of mood changes, maybe a bit of insomnia, she might even be getting some night sweats before her period starts, or whatever it might be, or maybe there's no signs of ovulation sort of happening, then the first thing we're going to be thinking is that excess estrogen relative to low progesterone. So how do we sort of, gently address that. And that might look like something like adding some magnesium into their system, some vitamin C, which is one of the oldest tricks in the book for raising serum levels of progesterone because of how vitamin C supports the adrenal function. It might be looking at her diet to make sure she's actually eating enough, because more often than not, I actually find that women are not eating enough, or they're eating a lot of calories but very nutrient poor. So they're not actually fueling their system with all the building blocks for hormones, which are fiber, good fats, and protein. So those are the three things that are the building blocks for all of the hormones in your body. So I try to help women make up those meals with those things. So it might be that nutritional medicine from the food, because food is obviously medicine, or it could be using some specific herbs to help to lift progesterone, or help to gently metabolize estrogen. But that would sort of be individual based on the person. But then just as important as that, it might be looking at some stress reduction techniques that are actually going to work for this woman. Because remember that when cortisol's high, it's going to be robbing progesterone. Then we'll get this relative estrogen excess, and we'll get that flow-on effect as well. So, if she's not sleeping enough, if she's not moving enough, or if she's moving too much, or trying to if she's training for a marathon, or any of those sorts of things that could be additional stressors on her body, if she doesn't have that autonomic nervous system regulation, which is obviously, as chiropractors, Maria, that's what we're looking at every single day. And then the other testing that I also just really like to look at for women is just doing just a good health check. So what are her vitamin D levels doing? Because vitamin D is also a hormone that's a critical building block for all of that. It's critical for, her thyroid function and everything else as well. Vitamin D and magnesium are also synergistic. So we need the two of them to, absorb and assimilate with one and the other. So it's all well and good to be taking magnesium, but if your vitamin D levels are rock bottom, then you're going to have, compromised absorption of that at that gut level. I do like to look at women's insulin levels. I like to look at her inflammatory markers as well, just to make sure that we're not missing anything there. And what else would I normally do in a standard blood test? Obviously looking at a full blood count and looking at her liver and kidney function, also looking at a lipid study as well, just to make sure that her cholesterol levels and the cholesterol ratios are all within what we would consider to be a healthy range. Also making sure she's eating enough good fats too. I like to look at her B12 levels, because I think that is critical, because that's going to affect cellular replication. It's going to affect, all sorts of different things, including even just pain receptivity. When B12 is low, then we struggle with that. And such a big thing for women as well is iron. I'm almost surprised and suspicious if I see a blood test with women with good levels of iron who aren't supplementing. And the reason I'm suspicious of that is because ferritin, which is the storage protein of the iron in the liver that comes up on an iron panel, if it's within a good healthy range, which to me is a little bit higher than what that sort of baseline cutoff would be from a standard lab, because ferritin is also an acute inflammatory marker, if ferritin is normal, I'll always compare it to their inflammation as well, just to make sure it hasn't risen artificially and it's not a red herring. So, there's all of those factors combined. I like to look at their androgen hormones as well, their sex hormone binding globulin, and I love looking at DHEA, which is the building block or the mother hormone to everything else as well, because that sort of gives me a big whole picture of how their system's functioning. I like to look at their thyroid too, but this is in an ideal world.
I love that.
Too much to that, but I was just thinking of other.
No, I mean, there's definitely not too much to it, but I think what it beautifully summarizes is that it should be more than just a regular blood panel, and there's a lot of nuance to what you're talking about, and I think it comes back to our original conversation on the previous episode, and it's been reconfirmed and emphasized today, is the importance of having the right practitioners around you, and also the right practitioners around you that know when it's not their jam, in the sense of hormones are not my specialty. We start talking about other different aspects of stress adaptation and life design, then that's my jam. Let's go. Human behavior, let's go. And also from that neurological, let's switch everybody's to start working on switching lights back on in people's system and getting them reconnected so that their potential can be released. Absolutely. And from a structural point of view, absolutely. But once it starts coming to these nuances of testing, it's not my jam. And it's also okay if you're seeing a practitioner, if it is not their area of expertise or focus, they actually should be telling you that, not just trying to help you broad sweeps going, try that. I tried that once. It worked great for me. And I see that I see that far too often, which is a bit scary, and that's a whole other conversation. But I think what you beautifully summarised was the complexity of a person with female hormones and the complexity of how that actually functions within our system, and the importance of understanding that we don't need to endure pain and we don't need to endure inflammation. It's actually understanding how do you recognize it first so you can actually do something about it. So I love that summary. When people are getting more severe symptoms, and then quite regularly these days, endometriosis gets spoken about a lot. My gorgeous wife went through a hysterectomy year before last now. Is that right? Yeah, year before last now.
Yep. Okay.
Because of the severity of endometriosis and adenomyosis that was in her system since she was a teenager. And it was something that, again, I think I took for granted a little bit, in the sense of, how bad could it be? Because I'd never lived with it. I mean, I understood it, but I think until you actually see somebody, and I would imagine you see people in practice that are in excruciating pain more often than they are not, it's just brings a different layer of understanding. And how often are you seeing it? How prevalent do you see it being? And what are the best steps for people to take, particularly when they're still hoping to have kids or planning a family? Some steps, Dr. Andrea, some wisdom. We might not be able to unpack this all today, but just some starting points for people.
Yeah, great. Okay, so endometriosis is something that is obviously gaining a lot of traction in media and research, and as it absolutely should be. So statistically, about 1 in 10 women are diagnosed with endo, but I think it's much higher than that, because even now, even though there's a lot of emphasis placed on endometriosis, the actual official diagnosis of it still requires a laparoscopic surgery. So it still requires surgical procedure with histological confirmation of it. So they take a sample of that tissue, they look at it under a microscope and go, yep, that's endometriosis. That process for some women can take 7 to 10 years to actually get an official diagnosis. In my opinion, it can absolutely be diagnosed via symptoms and a diagnostic internal ultrasound or transvaginal ultrasound alone. So our technology for that these days is so much better, and there's really clear signs on an ultrasound that will show whether or not endometriosis is likely. And there's 3 different types of endometriosis as well. It's not just one homogeneous condition. So there's 3 different kind of specific phenotypes. So one is endometriomas, which is the endometriosis within the ovary. So like, ovarian cysts, but that contain the sort of endometriosis. The other one is superficial peritoneal endometriosis, which is, I like to think of it as like moss growing on rocks. So I think this is an analogy used by someone that I've taken. I can't remember who it was, but it just is a really good way to sort of explain it. So that's endometriosis that's quite superficial. And then there's the deep infiltrating endometriosis, which is the usually the one that wreaks the most havoc. So this is the one that adheres and can infiltrate, the bowel, the bladder, all of those sorts of things. That is usually associated with the most amount of dysfunction as well. But it doesn't really matter what type women have. It doesn't directly indicate their symptomatology. So they could have technically mild endometriosis in terms of their adhesions, but it doesn't mean that their symptoms will be any less than someone who has, quite advanced sort of stage or gradings of endo. I am seeing this so commonly in practice, but that's possibly just because of the sample of the patients that I see. And, endometriosis is one of my areas of specialty because of that. And usually we get pretty clear clues on endo from when women were menstruating to begin with. So if we go back and look through their reproductive health history, a woman might tell me this classic picture of, she got her period around 12. She was having even pelvic pain before her period actually started, before she even had that initial onset of menarche. And there's maybe some family history of, and maybe not classified as endometriosis, but she remembers, my dad's sister had to have a hysterectomy because her periods were so horrible. Mum also had terrible periods where she would faint, all of that sort of thing. So, there's some really big clues there that not that endometriosis is hereditary, it's not genetic, but I do think you inherit shitty hormones from your parents. And so that's sort of part of that picture, in my opinion. And I like to think of endometriosis as almost like an autoimmune condition, because it is an immune-mediated condition that's exacerbated by hormonal imbalances. And while the actual causation of it is there's no sort of official agreement on what causes endometriosis. Some resources will say that it's from retrograde menstruation, so where the menstrual blood regurgitates back into the uterus rather than it coming out. They might also think of it as this embryological spread. So it's there from development, but, we don't get symptoms of that until we start, obviously having a menstrual cycle. So there's a whole bunch of different theories around that, but what we do know is it's an immune-mediated condition that's exacerbated by hormonal imbalances. And one of the reasons we know that is that women can get new onset endometriosis after an infection. So, for example, I had a patient who went to Mexico. She got, I think it was Giardia or some sort of very severe gastrointestinal infection. And then because of the stimulation of all of the, bacterial populations and the increase in inflammation in her system from that, she then had new onset endometriosis after that.
Yeah, right.
Now, she probably already had that endometrial tissue there, but it just got, I guess, activated or stimulated from that. But that's always an easier picture to sort of kind of change if it's that sort of new onset, I guess. Now, the other reason that I treat it like an autoimmune condition is that women tend to get some symptomatic relief from anti-inflammatory diets. Stress reduction, using autoimmune or immune system calming agents or supportive agents like, for example, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids or fish oils, which can, for some women, can be comparable to anti-inflammatories for period pain. All of those ways of reducing that systemic inflammation while we're trying to, work on the individual picture that for that woman it might be the heavy bleeding, so calming all of those sorts of things and getting those hormones balanced so that she's not getting this constant, if she's got, for example, low progesterone, she's going to have elevated prostaglandins, which are the pain, contractive sort of chemicals that happen with the period. So that's just at the very surface level, and then we sort of get deeper and deeper and we sort of go from there. But that's sort of just touching on it.
Yeah, and as I said, we won't get time to unpack it, but I think it's a good starting point. Again, the complexities. I think that might end up being the title of today's episode, is the complexities of female hormones are many, and they do say we're complex beings for a reason, I think, and this is one of the many, and not as simple as somebody with male hormones journeys. I think that's one of my biggest takeaways of our conversations. And also the importance that we're overlaying the right information to the right situation, whether that's how people are approaching their nutrition from whether it's fasting point of view or how they're actually planning out their meals, how they're planning out their rest. For those that are in a relationship with a man who has a more simplified version of how their bodies function, is just even keeping that communication pathway clear as to why things perhaps need to change a little bit with level of activity and how quickly you're going to be doing things moving forward, as well as the nutrition and also the testing that's involved. If things are not at a pain-free ease, and with pain-free and with ease when it comes to our hormones, that's my biggest takeaway today, is it actually should have a relative amount of ease to all of it. And the more difficult it is and the less ease that there is, the more likely you actually need some assistance to get it back into a state of ease, or perhaps we could even use the term homeostasis for where we are at that point in time, and just allowing our innate intelligence to work through with less interference, which, let's face it, Dr. Andrea, in a modern day life is getting more and more difficult. I'm sure you have something to add to that. I can see you ready to add something to what I just said.
Oh, Maria, I love that you just added the innate intelligence aspect to that. And it's so fascinating that there's been a couple of studies that have come out recently that show that endometriosis progression is worsened when there's poor vagal tone. So when our vagus nerve isn't functioning very well. So there's a very good therapeutic argument for vagal stimulation, and obviously vagal function is something that we're checking every single day.
Yes. Well, it might not be obvious to our listeners. To Aligned You listeners, if you weren't aware, when you're getting adjusted by your chiropractor, one of the things that we're doing is actually stimulating your nervous system and helping its regulation come back to homeostasis, hopefully with more ease, and getting rid of that interference without other interventions being necessary as well. Dr. Andrea, any final thoughts as we bring today's chat to a close? I might even manage to wrangle her on for a third time, folks. We'll see. We'll see. She does have a podcast of her own. All of the links will be in the show notes, by the way.
Thanks. Thanks, Maria. It's always so fun chatting to you, though. I would so happily come back, Maria, because you ask such big questions as well, and I love it. So some final thoughts. Look, I think for all women, and I know as cliche as this sounds, it's worth putting in the work. Like, if you haven't experienced the ease of a pain-free period or the ease of balanced hormones, then you're absolutely missing out, because I think you're at the mercy of just what your body or your hormones is doing from month to month. And it shouldn't be like that. That's not the way your body is designed to function. And again, in my opinion, all women are capable of having, pain-free, easy cycles and balanced hormones. It's a lot harder for some, especially if they've got something like endometriosis, and it might require, an integrative, collaborative approach, but it is possible. And, for the thousands and thousands of patients that I've seen with endo, more often than not, that is, the possibility. So I just think if your body isn't functioning the way that you think that it should be, and you're suffering, then it's worth putting in the time and effort for balance.
I think I love that. I think it's a beautiful way to finish, is that time and energy to create the foundations and the structure so that we can function beautifully around it, which is, again, I think what draws many chiropractors to what they do in our hands-on work is that we're really helping people structure, function to come into a better alignment so they can be functioning better around that, and that works it throughout our bodies and our systems and beyond. So Dr. Andrea Huddleston, thank you so much for your time on the mic today. It's so appreciated. And we'll, as I said, Aligned You listeners, I'll work on getting her back on in a couple of months' time. Can't take up too much of the time. But that's it for this week, Aligned You listeners. Bye for now, and I'll catch you next time.
And that's it for today's episode, Aligned You listeners. Remember to hit the 5-star ratings and share today's episode with your friends. And be sure to join our collective on Facebook and Instagram at Aligned You. Look forward to catching you next time. The information shared on Aligned You podcast is of general nature and for information purposes only. It is not specific medical or personal advice. You should seek assistance from your healthcare practitioner for your individual circumstances. Any information provided doesn't imply endorsement or third-party devices or products and cannot provide you with health and medical advice.